Good evening, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami. We're continuing with the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, Swami Kriyananda's commentary, based on Paramhansa Yogananda's interpretation of this scripture. We are still in chapter 2, we're up to stanzas 62 and 63. This is this wonderful, frightening, but marvelous progression of how we go from being okay to not being okay. Dwelling mentally on sense objects breeds attachment to them. From attachment arises craving. From craving, when frustrated, springs anger. Anger produces delusion. Delusion causes forgetfulness of the self, loss of memory as to what one is in truth, causes decay of the power of discrimination. From loss of discrimination ensues the annihilation of all right understanding. When Swamiji wrote this commentary, he also retranslated the Gita. Master had done a literal translation of the Gita. Swamiji edited it somewhat to give us not only the meaning of the verses exactly, but also the feeling of them by using very exact languages. Like I love when he says, loss of memory as to what one is in truth causes decay of the power of discrimination. I'm going to go through all of this a little more carefully. But even that very concept, the power of discrimination decays. And what does it mean when something decays? It means that it gradually falls apart. You know, you see something, you see a decaying plant or decaying building. It wasn't like it was healthy today and dead tomorrow. It's just that gradually its leaves turn a little brown, and gradually it's not quite up so straight, and then gradually it turns into compost. But it happens just a little piece at a time. And so it happens with us when we start down this trail that Krishna lays out for us about how this happens, which is one of the ways that these things happen, that it isn't like everything is fine and then I'm over here. It's like we go in that direction just a little at a time, and we hardly notice. I'm of an age where time passes much more quickly. You know, as a child, a few hours is a really, really, really long time. When I was working, as I do have many years, have done many times, when we have our school play and our K through 8th grade. Now we also have a high school, but the K through 8th, we do a big theatrical production every year, and I've often worked on the costumes. And this last year we did the play Abraham Lincoln, as it was. It's online, Living Wisdom School of Palo Alto. It was really a wonderful production. And these are really serious plays. These are not little kiddie performances. We pour ourselves into them, the teachers and the students. Well, I had some complication about the people who were doing a lot of the sewing for me. I don't do it myself anymore. And it interfered with one of my seamstresses, her granddaughter's birthday. And as a consequence, a whole lot of costumes were delayed until the very last minute, which I don't like it to happen that way, but I explained to the children that it was somebody's granddaughter's birthday, and they completely understood the importance of that. But as a result, right up to the very first dress rehearsal, some of the children hadn't seen their costumes. And they would ask me every time they saw me, are my costumes here yet? And I was sitting with these girls, and they were about 8 maybe, and we were just talking about various things related to the play. And they had asked me at the beginning of the conversation if their costumes had arrived yet. And like 8 minutes later in the conversation, one of the little girls said, are the costumes here yet? And I pointed out that we'd all been together and there'd been no sign of them, a kind of logic that I later learned was really not the right logic, because I mentioned it to one of the teachers, and she said, well, for a child of 8, 8 minutes is a really, really long time. And so from their point of view, it was quite possible that they could have been finished and delivered in that 8-minute span. It was a very helpful realization for me. I'm of an age where life really starts spinning. Time is so elastic, I really don't understand it. Every time these webinars come around again, it's like, how could it come around again? What happened to all the days in between? But I know they were all there because I can chart my activities. But nonetheless, here we are again. So when I look at the world around me, right outside the window, outside of the frame of the camera here, is this huge fig tree that I see right from the living room window, and I've lived with this view for about 10 years. A fig tree is deciduous, right? The leaves fall off. So it goes from being full of leaves to having those, and then of course green figs, then black figs, which we're gorging ourselves on now, and the black figs, and then the leaves will change. Then they'll get beautiful in the fall. Then they'll go away, and I'll look out again, and it'll be a bare tree. And then before we know it, there it'll be starting over again. And this constant cycle that nature presents to us of the way things grow, and then they change, and then they grow, and then they change. Swamiji made the marvelously important statement once that everything in this world is a symbol of a higher reality. I really had a hard time really understanding that when he first said it, because you think of things in this world as an end in themselves. Even he said the sun itself is just a symbol of the spiritual eye. Now, it also tells us, because the external world appears to us to be so much bigger than the internal world, that it's hard for us to think of the sun, which we think of as one of the biggest things in our physical world, is actually just being a symbol for something here that, until we really step into that reality, doesn't seem as large as the sun. So it's helpful for us lots of times to try to see behind what Divine Mother is making so explicit, to see behind what's really trying to happen. And even this rhythm of flowering and then change and then fruit and then death seems to be coming, but then it renews itself again. Getting in tune with those, with the power of nature itself, also begins to awaken us to the power of the soul's development, and of course the coming and going of our own physical bodies. And the more we can live in an everyday way with a constant awareness that this world is not what it seems, the more powerfully we feel inspired to become a cause in our experience, and not merely to always just be rolling along with the tides. There's a thought I have. Let me see if I can find it again. It's an interesting fact. In this book I've written about Swami Kriyananda, which will be published in the spring of 2019. The book is finished, but now we're working on the publishing. There's many interesting facts, many interesting things. And one of the things that Swami talks about in there was attunement to nature, and how, as he put it, uniquely American, not uniquely, but characteristically American it is for us to draw spiritual inspiration from the natural world. He said it's not unique to America, but it is characteristic of America. And he said, interestingly, because of the influence, the subtle influence of the indigenous people of this land, he said, even though the attunement to nature that the indigenous people, the American Indians here, developed, he said, even though it seems to be lost now, he said it isn't lost. It's here, and it's influencing us, and it will come forth eventually. I mean, now we're fighting against nature. We're not harmonizing with nature, but Divine Mother has a corrective in mind, and it will come. An interesting side of that just here is that when you look at so many of the chants that Master wrote, especially "O God Beautiful," which in many ways was kind of a signature chant of Master, and he runs through all these different aspects of nature. In the forest, thou art green. In the rivers, thou art restless. In the ocean, thou art grave. And so many of the images he uses are of the natural world. I am the sky, Mother. I am the bubble, make me the sea. O thou blue sky under blue cover. It's just he's always using images of nature. And it is because that's part of Dwapara Yuga. And also that was a particular way he came to America for a purpose. And America is the Dwapara Yuga country. And he's drawing on that ancient inspiration and expressing it again. Well, all of this comes out of the single word in this verse, the word decay, which also tells us how change takes place and then renewal takes place again. So let me now deal specifically with this verse. I wrote out just so I could keep it straight, these different stages. This is what this verse, 62 and 63 of chapter 2 of the Gita tells us. It starts with, he says, dwelling on sense objects. And dwelling on sense objects, now bear in mind, our consciousness can rove in many directions. And we just direct our attention to whatever our vrittis compel us to direct our attention toward, what our conscious mind makes a determination to direct us toward, or what grace calls us to. But at all times, we're focused somewhere on something. Usually we have a plethora of thoughts all going on at the same time. And what we concentrate on is what we experience. If we concentrate on past traumas and relive them and worry about them and stay in them, then that's what we experience. We experience those traumas. It's not so easy necessarily to separate ourselves from them, but, a very simple and obvious fact is that a trauma was something that happened, not necessarily something that's happening. But if we dwell on it, then it becomes the present as well as the past. If we have work to do and we have a project that we're concentrating on, we put our attention there. If we're watching a movie, we watch the movie. I've been recently making an audio book of the book that I've written, and this is not the first audio book I've made, but it's very interesting because you have to hold your mind word by word. And most of the time when we read, we're taking in more than one word at a time. But if you're trying to articulate it and make sense out of it, you can only think of one word at a time. And it's been very interesting to me to see how often when I mispronounce something, it's because I'm starting one word and then picking up a piece of the word that comes after. Even without realizing it, I just get scrambled up by those other sounds instead of finishing the sound that I'm on. And then every so often, a random other thought will cross my mind, and almost invariably, I'll make a mistake in the reading. So the point here is that we direct our consciousness. Our consciousness is either compelled by our desires and our past karma, or it is directed by our conscious will, but it can choose a wide variety of things to be focused on. So the Gita says, when we dwell on the objects of the senses, on sense objects, okay? Now, sense objects doesn't just mean sensual experiences or degraded experiences necessarily. Sense objects are everything that we perceive with our senses. It can be the beautiful home that you've built for yourself, or the lovely child that you have in your family, or it can be a desire for the apple pie that's, waiting in the kitchen that you can just go in and have it, or any pleasurable thing that can come through your body, music even, whatever it might be. It's if you dwell on sense objects, what happens from that, the Gita tells us, is that dwelling, as he puts it again, Dwelling mentally on sense objects, and here's another one of Swami's great words, breeds attachment to them. Breeds is the opposite side of decay, isn't it? It's not like when you first think of it, instantly you're attached to it, but the more you dwell on it, even that word dwell is when you settle in and continually contemplate it. We speak of our dwelling place, and we have mental dwelling places where we sit and fantasize about when my prince will come, or when I get pregnant and get to have a baby, when we get rich enough to have a new home, when I can finally buy a Tesla, a red Tesla, whatever it might be. If the mind is dwelling on it, it breeds attachment, which is the more energy you put into something, the more energy it begins to have for you. This is also Krishna telling us that, and this is the whole point of this verse in the end, is you cut it out, you cut it from the beginning. You don't allow yourself to dwell on these objects of the senses, to fantasize, to daydream, to imagine that I will be happier when. You know, life is fine now, but I will be happier when. I remember sometimes people would come to me, and it was usually about relationships, because that's a deep desire that people have that is not usually under your control to manifest. If you want to have a Tesla, you can work hard often to buy one. If you want to have a nice home, you can work hard to buy one. But you can't always make someone love you, even if you want them to love you, or meet a compatible person, even if you want to. And I remember on more than one occasion, usually it was a woman, but sometimes it was also, sometimes men would come with the same longing and ask for some solution to the restlessness that the unfulfilled desire was creating in them. And they would have a tendency to dwell on the idea of everything will be better when I meet this person and my life will start. And so they would naturally develop an attachment to that happening. But I would try to roll it back a little bit by saying to someone, for example, make a list of all the good things that you think will come into your life when you finally have this kind of relationship. And especially all the things that you think you will be able to do, and all the ways in which you will be pleased with the person you become when that happens. I said, now, some of those things are not going to be possible for you, but a great many of them are. A great many of them are equally available to you now, but you have in your mind that this circumstance is required before they can occur. I said, the only solution to this is because not I, nor you, nor anyone can make this happen for you. But if you begin to manifest in your life the things you imagine you can't do until, then for one, your life is going to be a lot more pleasant. Number two, you're going to become a more magnetic person, thus increasing your chances of attracting someone to you. And in the event that this is not your karma, you won't have wasted all this time just sitting here waiting. So what happens to us, the Gita describes, we dwell on the objects of the senses, which is everything that requires a material body to experience. Then we become attached to those things. And once we become attached to those, how does he put it? From attachment arises craving. All these words are so fluid. You know, craving, again, craving is an ongoing reality. So we have dwelling, and then we have it breeds attachment, so the attachment grows. And then the more attached we become, the more we crave it. Now, these are not simple things. I'm not saying that all of this can be overcome just by reading this verse. But when we have an idea of what the map is that gets us in so much trouble, then we have a chance of being able to back it up. So we think about it a lot, then we become attached to it, then we begin to long for it. And then, when our longings, our cravings are frustrated, then we get angry. And sometimes anger actually expresses as depression. Sometimes anger frustrated, when you don't know what to do with your anger, you just become sad. But when our desires are frustrated, we become angry. We become angry at God, we become angry at other people, we become angry with ourselves. And a lot of times that anger, because there's nothing you can do about it, sometimes it just makes you depressed and your energy just doesn't know where to go. Anger produces delusion. This time we don't have to wait. This one doesn't decay or breed. Anger produces delusion. We just get confused. We begin to think that there's just only one solution to my life. Swamiji talked about the fact that the secret of prosperity is creativity, he says. And he explains it in greater detail, but and poverty consciousness, which is a phrase, an impoverished attitude toward life, is believing that your choices are limited and that I have one solution, and if that fails, I have one possibility for happiness, and if that falls through, then it's over for me. If I've failed in one way, I've failed completely. Creativity says, well, that didn't work, so now I'll try this. This hope wasn't realized, so now I'll try that. This life plan turned out not to really be in the cards for me, so now I'll try that one. But when we become angry and we think there's only one, I want this, I'm not getting it, we become angry, we just narrow ourselves down. Is that the world must conform to what I've decided it must conform to. I mean, that in itself is delusion, because the ego's not in charge. I mean, we can, with our will, influence events. But in the end, we are part of a greater reality. We are not in charge. This is the difference between a truly spiritual attitude toward life and merely what I might call New Age attitude toward life. I don't even know if the phrase New Age is being used anymore. But the idea that I have power, which is a good idea, but God has more, which is a better idea. When we become angry, we fall into delusion. And then he says, delusion causes forgetfulness of the self with a capital S. Forgetfulness of the self means that I am lost in the singularity of my own limited consciousness. I had this sense reality that I wanted to live. I desired this. I didn't get it. Now I'm so angry, and all I am is this angry. I've forgotten that I am part of a greater reality. I've forgotten that this is just a little experience in this tremendous cycle of many incarnations. I've forgotten that God loves me. I've forgotten that service is joy. I've forgotten everything because I became angry because I didn't get what I wanted. I thought about it. I began to become attached to it. I craved it. I didn't get it. I got mad. Now I get mad. I forget everything else. Forgetfulness of self. And it results then in loss of memory as to what is in truth. And loss of memory as to what is in truth causes, there we are, decay of the power of discrimination. So now I want something, I didn't get it, I become angry, I get deluded. When I get, not diluted, we get diluted too, but deluded. I get deluded, I forget that I'm part of a greater reality, that God is my divine mother, and I'm part of, and she loves me. And then I forget as to what one is in truth. That's forgetting the self. And it causes decay of the power of discrimination. And discrimination is the ability to tell the real from the unreal. That's what discrimination is. And real from unreal goes through every level of our awareness. When we're really just beginning even to awaken to our own reality, we have to use discrimination to be able to tell what is my subconscious projection on the world around me and what is simple objective truth. People who are mentally unbalanced, what happens when you become extremely mentally unbalanced is that you retreat into a world it has no objective reality. It's just a subjective world that you define. When I was ill once, I was staying at this is after I was living at the Ananda community, but I went back to visit my parents, and while I was there, I caught a terrible flu. I fortunately have very good health as a rule, and very rarely have fevers. But I was sick in my parents' house with a very high fever. When it went down to 101, I thought I was healed. So I don't know how high it had gotten before that. But at a certain point in that fever, I became quite delusional, although I didn't realize it. And I was curled up in the bed there, in the fetal position, just really in a tight little ball like this. And I was aware of the fact that I needed to stay in that tight curl, because if I uncurled my arms and my legs, my body would split into 4 directions. So the only way I could keep my body intact was to keep it curled up like this. And who knows how long I stayed like that. But then gradually, the fever started breaking, I don't recall, or maybe just normal intelligence asserted itself. And I sort of was in my fever, I was going through this logical progression that I could remember other times in my life when I had lain just with my arms and my legs out. And I didn't fly into 4 pieces. So the chances were at least possible that if I uncurled, it wouldn't happen this time. And I remember very, very gingerly, just like putting out an arm to see what happened, and then with enormous sense of discovery, stretched out and remained intact. Now, that was a fever-induced psychosis. But we do this all the time. We get it in our head that so-and-so doesn't like me. We get it into our mind that when you looked at me, this is what you meant. I'm a person who is often in front of large crowds of people, and I've never been very good at holding my face neutral. My face tends to look like whatever is going on behind it. And sometimes a lot of very intense thoughts go through it. And on more than one occasion, I have discovered that people have taken personally what actually had nothing to do with them. But they happened to be in front of me when the thought was going on behind my face, and so the face was projected at them. Now, this used to happen to Swami Kriyananda also, because people were very sensitive to him. He was more conscious of his impact, and I've tried to be more conscious as I've grown older. But when I was his secretary, people would write, I'm so sorry about what happened the other day. I know you were upset with me, but I didn't really mean to. And they have these long letters, and Swami would say, he would hand it to me like this, could you please find out what the heck they're talking about? Because it was just a projection of subconscious thinking. And a lot of times, enormous misunderstandings happen between people because someone is just subjectively convinced that it really happened, and just, goes on a campaign to prove that you're not admitting it. Well, sometimes that's true, but many times it's just a lack of discrimination about what is actually objective truth, what to speak of divine truth. So once we lose the power of discrimination because emotions have confused our minds, we lose the power of discrimination. And from loss of discrimination ensues the annihilation of all right understanding. I love language. Annihilation. Oh, that is such a big word. And when you annihilate something, it's much more than pushing it aside. It has ceased to exist. And so once we lose discrimination, we've annihilated all right understanding. We just can't know anymore what's really going on around us. Now, this applies in the tiniest way with our human relationships, but it is our relationship with God. We get set on a certain way of doing things. We get attached. We want it. We get angry when we're frustrated. When we get angry and frustrated, delusion has a hold of us. When delusion causes us to forget the higher truths, then we lose the power to discriminate because we no longer know what is true and what isn't. So it's a really serious cycle that we have to find a way to break. And also it's a way that we can say, how did I get here? Because sometimes we just find ourselves either alone in our own thoughts or in our business relationships or in relationships with people where everything is just spun out of control. So we have to ask ourselves, how did I get here? I had a very interesting experience once where I was working on a project, and it was a new project, and it was a little complicated. Let me see if I can tie this all together. And I had an intuition, which I really felt was a true intuition, about how the situation should be resolved. But what happened was, I became very fixed on my intuition, and I became very attached to my intuition, and then I really wanted my intuition to be followed, and then I got very angry when people did not follow my intuition, and then I forgot that these were my friends, and then I forgot that we were all part of the same project, and then I lost discrimination, and I started behaving in a very bad way, and everything was a mess. But when I finally got to the point where everything was such a mess, I started walking the project back, walking it back. How did I get here? How did I get so confused? And I was able literally to follow, I don't think I used this template, but I knew it. I followed it all the way to the back. And finally, just to describe that exact situation, I wrote a letter to all my friends because now my discrimination had returned. And I remembered that they were all intuitive, capable people. And I was no longer frustrated because they weren't following my desires. We were all in this together. And so I wrote to them and said, I had to be honest. And the truth was, I said, I had an intuition about what we ought to do. And I said, it may have been a true intuition. But even if it were, my subsequent actions caused it, invalidated it, and certainly made it nothing that anybody else wanted to go to. In the end, as it happened, once everything calmed down, they did exactly what I had suggested, which was just a small satisfaction to me, only because it confirmed that it had been, in fact, a superconscious intuition, which was nice for me, but it didn't in any way change my behavior. I mean, it didn't in any way justify my behavior. So when we can keep these steps really in our minds, dwelling on sense objects, attachment, craving, anger when the desire is thwarted, then becoming deluded about the nature of the self, forgetting higher truths altogether, losing our discrimination, and then our understanding is annihilated. When you find yourself in a position where understanding has been annihilated, ask yourself, how did I get here? And it's a very good introspection exercise to try to find the point, if you can, where you first went wrong. Not only is it helpful for explaining yourself to yourself, and perhaps explaining yourself to others, you can say, well, I really became attached to this result, and from that point on, I wasn't thinking straight. And people can sympathize with you. It can also tell you that the next time you start really being attached to a certain result and be getting angry when people are not listening or when you're not getting it, you can think, wait a minute, I know where this goes. And the annihilation of understanding is not a place where I want to end up. I find, at least in my life, but given who I am, that having a very clear, simple understanding of the spiritual path, because the principles are really simple, and just having a number of systems, I have probably a dozen, that are just very simple principles, templates, that whenever I know that I'm off, which we all know that we're off when we're off, or we wake up to it eventually, I can say, how did I get here? And therefore, how can I avoid it the next time? So now, in the commentary, Swamiji begins to deal with, the other side of this. And he says, the first question you have to ask, even to implement this, the solution to this dilemma, is you have to have right understanding and you have to have some discrimination. And the first question is, am I suffering? Do I like suffering? And not only what causes it, but what will relieve my suffering? Master wrote before he left India, when he came to America in 1920, he had an inspiration of how he could communicate these teachings to the West. Now, bear in mind, this is 1920. I mean, this is, in terms of the spiritual revolution, the globalization of the planet, the integration of East and West, 1920 was pretty much before all of it. So Master is called by God. He gets on that ship leaving India, which I believe they said was one of the first ships sailing from India to America after World War I. And he arrives in America. It is believed, I believe, he was the third Swami from India to come to American soil. Swami Vivekananda came first. No, I believe Swami Ramatirtha came first. Swami Vivekananda came second, and Yogananda came third. Now, maybe there were some others in there that I've forgotten. Maybe Vivekananda, some of his Swamis came. But there weren't many. It was pretty unusual. And Master is coming from this extremely traditional Indian culture. It was more intact at that point. They were still suppressed by the British. It was almost 30 years before India became independent, but the Hindu culture was very strong. And Master, how is he going to bring that to America? I mean, there's no way. So Master had to really pray and meditate on how am I going to communicate this? And he had some ideas, which was written into a book called The Science of Religion, which was a very good East-West title, Science of Religion. As it happened, actually, Master himself did not actually write the book. He outlined his ideas, and it was ghost-written by one of his disciples, a man named Swami Dhirananda, who was fluent in English, had been educated in English, and could therefore write for Master. Master was just learning the language. Later, many years later, Swami Kriyananda rewrote that book completely, ghost wrote it for Master a second time, and he called it God is for Everyone. Because Swamiji felt that the disciple who'd written it for Master the first time didn't have Master's vibration as much as he thought he should. But the idea were perfect. And the idea was very simple. And this is what Master said. Everybody has two desires in life: to find happiness, to escape suffering. And it's just really like, if you think about it, that's right. Every single decision that everyone makes. Now bear in mind, many of our decisions are misguided, so they do not bring us happiness and they do not alleviate suffering. But we are inspired to make those decisions because we think they will. You know, when somebody feels wronged by someone and pulls out a gun and murders them, they have the thought in their mind that you are causing me trouble. If I get rid of you, I won't feel so bad anymore. Now, it's a misguided thought, but even an action like that is that somehow this is going to work for me. Or I need drugs and you have money and you won't give me the money, so I'm going to kill you and take the money so that I can go buy these drugs. You think it will alleviate suffering and you think it will give you happiness. And the spiritual path is really very simple. It's an ever-increasing awareness of what actually causes us suffering and what will actually bring us happiness. Just from the lowest evolved human being or animal on the planet to the most enlightened saint, it's an ever more subtle answer to that question. So the whole science of religion and all of the complications that have come since are just based on those two principles. So Swamiji, writing about this verse, which is, you know, this complicating story of how we end up where we really don't want to be, It just starts from the question is, what is it that will relieve our suffering? And then Swamiji gives us a series of points of what will relieve it. He says, first, all suffering comes from too small a concentration on ourselves. When I was 19, my first understanding of self-realization came from a book that was given to me by a friend, by Swami Vivekananda, as it happens. And I remember 3 things from that book, and it completely changed my life. The first was a reference to the law of karma, which I didn't really think of in a big way at that time. It said, what you are today is the result of what you did yesterday. What you will be tomorrow is the result of what you do today. And I was desperately seeking how to avoid suffering and find happiness. And this was the first time with power that was said to me. Oh my gosh, I'm creating this myself. If I start behaving differently, then my reality will be different. The second was, love casts out fear. I didn't realize until much later that was actually from the Bible, where it says, perfect love casts out all fear. And that was very interesting to me because I had been thinking a lot at that time, and I had come up with something similar to that, which I had decided the only absolutely helpful feeling to have was fear, because it blocked everything else. But I didn't understand that perfect love is the opposite of fear, because perfect love leads to perfect love of God, and perfect love of God, which I will get to here, leads to a complete acceptance of every experience as God's will, and therefore what have I to fear? So it was a beautiful, powerful thought. And then the third one, which is relevant for here, was, don't think about yourself and you'll be happy. Now, all I ever thought about was myself, pretty much. I wasn't selfish, just because I wasn't by nature. I was generous by nature. I was born that way. I'm enthusiastic, and I prefer to share rather than to hoard. So in that sense, I wasn't selfish. But I was constantly preoccupied with my own position in things, and constantly, as I thought about it later, calculating my own advantage. And my own advantage not at the expense of others, but my own, I almost would call it having fun quotient. I was always calculating which would be the funnest choice for me, not at the expense of others, but always I knew where I stood in every situation. It was a complete revelation to me, completely incomprehensible. Like, what else is there to think about except me? And then, of course, gradually I've grown from that. I was barely out of adolescence. That's my only excuse. But the first thing that relieves suffering is what Swami calls a decrease of self-interest. What causes us to suffer is when we're so concerned, and this is the other side of it. What do I want? How can I get it? Am I getting it? If I'm not getting it, I'm angry. A decrease of self-interest is the same as saying, identifying with a greater reality. When I was, and the second part of it is that we realize that our reality is more than the ego. When I was a young woman, or when I was in my teens, I always assumed, more than I always assumed, I expected and I wanted that I would have children, that I would have many children. And when I discovered the spiritual path, especially when I met Swami Kriyananda and got more serious, I was 22 when I met him, so it was very early. I realized that what I wanted was to expand my sense of self. And I thought if I multiplied by having children, which sort of seemed like an expansion of self, then I would feel less limited. I also thought, and this was a side delusion, that merely giving birth to a child would make me a perfect person and therefore a wonderful mother, but especially a perfect person, because I would be a wonderful mother and therefore I would be a perfect person. And then with a sort of horrifying realization, I realized that you could get pregnant and give birth to a child and not essentially change. So that motivation for having children fell away. But the other thing that fell away was the realization that just having children would not relieve the essential confinement I felt, because the confinement was my limited identification with ego. Ego being the infinite self identified with limited form, this personality, this cultural tradition, these desires, these wants, that it was that agonizing sense of confinement that I needed to escape from. And merely having children would not change it at all. And virtually in a moment, from a lifelong desire, it just went away, because I realized what it is that I really wanted. That's what's happened through my whole Ananda life. It's like I can look back even really almost to my earliest memories and realize that my intention and my trajectory has always been exactly the same. I've learned gradually what it is I really wanted and what the solutions were, that the solutions were different than I expected, but the intention has always been the same. And that's what I came to when I really understood that it was ego itself that I needed to escape from, and therefore no particular action in this world would change that ego identity unless I consciously worked on it. It was the issue. Yes, of course, for many people, the unconditional love of having your own children, having children and raising them, is the beginning of the dissolution of the ego. So I wasn't entirely misguided. It just wasn't my path. So what relieves our suffering, what gets us out of this, is a decrease of our self-interest, recognizing that we have a reality that is more than the ego. And just that thought, as Swami puts it, decreases our delusion, because the core of all delusion is that I am separate, and that my happiness is entirely my little circle, that these are the things I want, and if I don't get them, I get angry and I get unhappy. To decrease in delusion is to realize that I am part of all that is. I am part of a much greater reality. Let us celebrate our own greater reality. That's what we say in the Festival of Light every week. It's a very subtle phrase. Let us celebrate our own greater reality. Because when we celebrate our unity with the greater reality, of necessity, it decreases our identification with the limited. And that begins to lift us out of delusion. And then when our desires are thwarted, which inevitably our desires will be thwarted. It's just like, get over it. We just don't get what we want. We cannot have it all. Or even if we get all the things that we want, we discover after we have them that they didn't quite do it for us. I mean, I never had to raise all those children to learn it, because I could see that if I was not making myself a better person, overcoming my limitations by conscious effort of will, I would not be better for having done anything. I could use anything, being an artist, being a doctor, being a professor, being a mother. I could use any of those things to decrease my self-interest, to expand my sense of self-identity. But it wouldn't be those things that caused it to happen. It would be because I myself committed to that. And therefore any form would do if I myself was committed to it. But when we understand that we're part of a greater reality, and we're not so attached to our personal outcomes, then there's simply anger doesn't arise. What is there to be angry about? God is providing me with whatever I need, and therefore I'm interested. There's two ways to say, God, why are you doing this to me? And God, why are you doing this to me? And it's the same words, but one is based on, I know what I want, I know what I need, and the other is based on, I'm not stupid, but I certainly don't know everything. Maybe there's something here that I really need to learn. So when we're no longer angry, Swami explains, we're able to accept what is. We're able to relate to reality. Swamiji often talks about, you have to accept reality. It doesn't mean you have to be content with things as they are, because you can use creativity and willpower and prayer and everything to influence circumstances. But first you have to just see what is. You have to relate to what is before you can transform it. And if you're so busy being angry, you can't see it. But if you're not angry anymore, you say, well, this seems to be what God has given me. This seems to be what my child is really like. I had an idea that this is what my child was going to do. I had an idea that this is what my husband was going to do. This is what my father was going to do. But now I'm part of a greater reality. I'm part of their reality. I just see what is. And as soon as you're willing to accept what is, then of course we become much less attached. Attached is based on there is only one option. And of course this is bringing us back to prosperity. And prosperity not just financially, but emotionally and in our family life and in our spiritual life, because we're not attached to just one result. We can see what is happening and we can accept it. And we've just become less interested we become more attuned to a flow of energy. And we're much less attached to the specific forms of things. If we can accept what is, then my child does not have to take over the family business, or my child, can't be gay. My child can't be an artist. He has to be a banker. Or my child can't be a banker. He has to be an artist. We just let things be. And Swami puts it, we have less interest in the objects of the senses, but the objects of the senses are the physical forms of things. So we just begin to we move more in a flow of energy. And once we move in a flow of energy, then we're moving much more with the long process of the divine, starting back with the fig tree. There's just, when you get attuned to these cycles of nature, you just feel it. It's this beautiful flow of energy. Everything grows together and it makes these beautiful figs. We take these beautiful figs, we enjoy them. We watch the tree go back again. And all the forms that we're looking at are beautiful. None of them is really better than the other because we're not attached to it. We're just not attached to any of the objects that our senses perceive. We look at them, but we also look through them. And this brings us back to everything is a symbol. Everything in this world is a symbol of this reality behind it. But if we're so attached to the form of things, and of course, the trouble with the form of things is that it never stays the same. It just never stays the same. Old age, disease, and death, eventually all forms disappear. Eventually all forms disappear if the time span is long enough. And even in our own realities, the form of my body will change, and everything that I've been defined by and connected with will also go away. And so we become more interested. We become more interested in understanding what's really true. What is wisdom? What is the reality of life itself? Okay. When we have moved back a little bit from our attachment to having the world be exactly as we want it, then begins to grow in our heart a real desire for truth. You don't want truth when you want things to be a certain way. You can't even approach truth if you want things to be a certain way, because you won't be able to accept anything that contradicts that. This is why attachment is blinding, as they say. So when you begin to step back from things a little bit, you realize how all that narrowness of focus causes us to suffer. Because that narrow focus, to be attached, to limited conditions that we can't control and that inevitably will dissolve, we ask ourselves, what is the point? Where does happiness come from? How do I really alleviate suffering? And then we become genuinely interested. We long for wisdom. And as Swami says, once we begin to long for wisdom, then also devotion becomes possible. Because when we begin to think in terms of what is God doing for me, what is trying to happen in this world, we begin to see a great deal that we love. We see a great deal that is lovable, would be the way to put it. It also, even quite apart from God, it begins to happen in all our relationships with other people. When we're attached to things being a certain way, this is not a happiness-producing way of living. When we want people to meet our desires, when we crave for them to meet our desires, and they don't, and we become angry, this does not create harmony and happiness. Now, all of these qualities have to be balanced with many other things, but there's a much more likelihood of love, fulfillment, happiness, harmony, when we have followed all these expansive steps that Swami is describing as the antidote to the descent into the annihilation of understanding. And this great capacity for devotion begins to come out of us. We can love the people around us much more selflessly. We will have the magnetism to draw more true and loving friends. We will have the understanding and wisdom of how to cultivate those friendships and to take them very deep. And we will begin to see in all the people around us, in the world around us, in the events around us, we'll begin to see the loving hand of Divine Mother behind it. Far from an annihilation of understanding, what will gradually grow in our hearts is this extraordinary sense of gratitude. You know, all of us have been through very difficult times in our lives. There's really no one, or virtually no one, who doesn't have to face something sooner or later. Some lives are more full of difficult external karma than others. But if you see someone whose life is all nothing but fortunate events, as Swami once said, you can't see all the lifetimes of tapasya that gave them this one. But if we're honest, and if we're not absolutely attached to things being the way that we want them to be, we really begin to notice that it always works out for the best. And even though sadness and suffering may always be a part of our reality, if we're honest, we also see how many, many virtues, compassion, kindness, and blessings of endless kinds are integrally involved with all those challenges. Without the need to rise to the occasion, to accept and embrace, we would never also become big enough to accept and embrace all that Divine Mother wants to give us. That's what we have to understand. And when we follow these steps, either downward to the annihilation of understanding or upward to devotion to God, then we find that life is really what we long for it to be, which is an ever-expanding experience of bliss. God bless you.